Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson and Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I'm Lynn Bergeson. The bipartisan 2016 Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act amendments enacted extensive changes to TSCA that many hoped would set the law on a new course, address TSCA's widely recognized challenges, and accelerate EPA's actions to address public health threats. Since then, 4 administrations have put their mark on implementation of the amended law. The past 10 years have seemed like a roller coaster of competing legal interpretations of some of Lautenberg Amendments' most extensive provisions, scientific debate and analyses, rulemakings, delays in EPA TSCA actions, and major milestones. To celebrate Lautenberg's 10-year anniversary, the Environmental Law Institute, the George Washington University Milken Institute of Public Health, and Bergeson and Campbell recently convened an all-day conference titled TSCA Reform 10 Years Later. The podcast you're about to hear is the panel discussion on risk evaluation. This panel focuses on EPA's most recent risk evaluations and how they compare with prior administrations' risk evaluation approaches, recent changes in direction of the controversial formaldehyde risk evaluation, and on EPA's proposed risk evaluation framework rule and its implications for protecting human health. Now, here is the panel discussion on risk evaluation from TSCA reform 10 years later.
Well, good morning, everyone. Risk evaluation. So what is that? It's the process under TSCA Section 6B that enables EPA to determine whether chemical substances or their conditions of use present an unreasonable risk to health or the environment, including with respect to potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations, but without regard to cost or other non-risk factors. And if EPA determines that a chemical or its conditions of use present an unreasonable risk, EPA must proceed to risk management rulemaking, the topic of the next panel. In the 10 years since the enactment of the 2016 amendments, EPA has completed 23 risk evaluations and 3 draft risk evaluations. They include ones for each of the initial 10 chemicals, plus legacy uses of asbestos, half of the first 20 high-priority substances, and 2 manufacturer-requested substances. Risk evaluations are generally massive documents, totaling hundreds of pages. In preparing them, EPA seeks to effectuate key science-related provisions of Section 26 of TSCA, consideration of the best available science, the weight of the scientific evidence, and reasonably available information. Risk evaluations include consideration of science policy questions as well. Not surprisingly, risk evaluations often prove to be controversial. Today's panel will discuss some of those controversies. I want to introduce these panelists, starting off at the far end with Kelly Lester, who is a senior attorney at Earth Justice. And next to her is Rashmi Joklar, Science Policy Director at the Department of Epidemiology, Population Health at Stanford University. Next to her is Kimberly Wise-White, Vice President, Regulatory and Scientific Affairs at the American Chemistry Council. And on my left is Judah Prero, counsel at the law firm of Arnold & Porter. So let's get started with the Risk Evaluation Framework Rule, which Lynn mentioned. In 2017, the first Trump administration adopted a procedural risk evaluation framework rule. The Biden EPA had problems with several of the risk evaluations that the Trump EPA had produced under that rule, so in 2024, the Biden EPA revised the rule. In 2025, the second Trump EPA proposed revising the 2024 rule, essentially back to the 2017 rule. Litigation challenging the 2024 rule has been put on hold by the DC Circuit pending outcome of the current rulemaking. TSCA Section 6B4 says that a risk evaluation is to determine whether a chemical substance presents an unreasonable risk under the conditions of use. The 2017 rule and the 2025 proposed rule would require separate risk determinations for each condition of use. The 2024 rule requires one risk determination for the chemical as a whole, while identifying the conditions of use that significantly contribute to that determination. This has been a major subject of contention. My first question is, why do we care? What's the practical significance of one approach versus the other? Judah, you want to start us off?
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to the organizers and for inviting me to participate today. It's always a pleasure to come and speak about TSCA. Now, I know not everyone always shares that opinion. At least people I hang out with socially don't necessarily think that that's the case, but I know I'm in good company here today. And so, Mark, I'm glad that the way you styled the question is looking at practical significance, because I know in years past we've discussed the legal significance, and there's plenty of briefs, comments that people could pick through to see all the legal arguments. And so looking at it from a practical standpoint, and from what I hear from clients as well, so one issue with regards to what we'll call the whole chemical approach is that it's hard to understand, notwithstanding the fact that EPA may have articulated how it goes about deciding which are the driving conditions of use or the exposure scenarios. It's still difficult to ascertain how that's actually done. That while there's words and you can read them, but in practice, it's a little bit difficult to understand. And especially since, just because of the way the program has been rolled out, there's just a limited set of scenarios what one can consider. And so that leads to a little bit of unpredictability and a lack of understanding by the potentially regulated community as to exactly how EPA goes about making these determinations. Now, I'll just add that notwithstanding the comments I just made, if you just look at the context of what EPA is evaluating, which are high priority chemicals, so you would guess that there is a likelihood that they're going to be found, that they're going to present a risk, and so, meaning as a whole. But the question is, if you are trying to identify what the drivers are, that's where there's going to be a gray area, and so that leads to questions. But I think another area which perhaps is more important is that if you would take the position that EPA didn't have to make a decision or a determination on the chemical as a whole, but rather it had the ability to do it on a condition by condition of use basis, that potentially could allow EPA to be a bit more, if I could say, nimble, if you could use that word for EPA, on moving forward with regulatory actions. If they weren't bound to take action upon the completion of an evaluation of every single condition of use, but rather it's not difficult to envision a scenario where they have a significant amount of data on a substance with regards to use and exposure. And while it's what they have determined is it's not necessarily an imminent hazard, but it definitely warrants attention and they can move forward. So if they were able to make determinations on a condition of use by condition of use basis, so then they could move forward with potential rulemaking and let the other areas lag behind a little bit. But they can't do that now. And so they have to wait until the entire evaluation is done, make that final determination, and then move forward. So I think it sort of it constricts, it handcuffs EPA a little bit in their ability to regulate those scenarios where they think that they might want to do so sooner rather than later.
Thanks. Anyone else want to speak up on that?
Yeah.
I thought you might.
Also, thank you to everybody for putting this together. I know it's a tremendous amount of work, and I actually share Judah's excitement at getting to talk about TSCA because my friends similarly don't want to talk about it as much as I do. So I would push back a bit on this characterization that there is confusion in the risk evaluation documents when they're taking this single determination approach. If you look at these documents, what they do is they actually go through and calculate risk for each of the conditions of use, And then they identify which ones are significant drivers of a finding of unreasonable risk. And so I think it's quite clear when you take a look at the document as a whole for the regulated community what might be coming down the pike in risk management. I also think one practical difference that's really important is that the use-by-use approach doesn't really allow you to look at risks posed by combinations of conditions of use, which is something that TSCA requires EPA to protect against and contemplates that EPA will look at in a risk evaluation. And so if you're looking just piecemeal at the risks posed by a condition of use in isolation, you're not looking at real-world risks from people who are exposed from multiple conditions of use. I think one other quick practical difference that I'll note is that the judicial review provisions end up looking very different if you're doing a whole chemical approach versus a use-by-use approach. And so you could end up actually in this really inefficient circumstance where you have some conditions of use that have been found not to present unreasonable risk that are immediately challenged, are held up in litigation for years, as we know is often the case in the TSCA world. And then the rest of the chemical is sort of proceeding towards risk management. And then what happens if that no unreasonable risk determination was found not to be proper? EPA would have to do it again. So I don't think the efficiencies from a use-by-use approach really, on balance, weigh in favor of that.
Another issue arising under the Risk Evaluation Framework Rule is the scope of risk evaluations. Under same Section 6B4, EPA must, within 6 months of initiating a risk evaluation, publish the scope of the risk evaluation to be considered, including the conditions of use that EPA expects to consider. So, Kelly, maybe you've got a view on this. Does this require EPA to address all conditions of use or only some? And how can EPA efficiently consider multiple conditions of use?
Yeah, so it does require them to look at all conditions of use. There is some discretion that the administrator has to determine what constitutes a condition of use. So it can look at whether it's a circumstance under which a chemical is known, intended, reasonably foreseen to be manufactured or processed or used, et cetera. But once it's made that determination, it can't then say, okay, we're going to take this out and not consider it in the risk evaluation. And so that expects to consider language really just reflects the reality that risk evaluation is a multi-year process. And at the beginning stage, you might not know exactly what circumstances constitute a condition of use. Things might change, uses might be discontinued, information might be provided by manufacturers that put into the scope of the risk evaluation some circumstances that were not known at the time. And so that's really what that expects to consider language represents. This was, weighed in on by the Ninth Circuit. They've confirmed that you can't say this is a condition of use and not look at it. That was in the Safer Chemicals case. I'll stop there just so that I'm not filibustering on risk evaluations.
Kimberly, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, let me jump in. And I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a lowly scientist. And so, I think about where you started, Mark, where we have seen the risk evaluation framework change over the last 10 years. And when we think about, I think we all agree that what we'd really like to make sure is that the chemicals that are on the market or that are entering the market are going to be safe for human health and the environment. And we all have that shared goal. We know that EPA has that as their primary mission as they're evaluating chemistries. What is not helpful is when the goalpost changes in the framework rule. And so you don't have an accurate understanding of what the criteria and the data and information that the agency is going to be utilizing to actually determine whether or not there is or is not unreasonable risk. Part of that is definitional. I know we've had a long-term debate on what unreasonable risk actually means, what's reasonably foreseen, what that means, and then getting to the most recent point on the scope of the risk evaluations. Yes, it's critically important to understand where the agency is going to be scoping, what specific conditions of use they're going to be looking at, and then how they're going to evaluate those conditions of use as part of the risk evaluation. One big challenge that we've had in that risk evaluation process is not understanding the scope of the risk evaluation, so which conditions are going to be considered, which conditions are not going to be considered. And while I agree with Kelly that there is opportunities for additional conditions of use to potentially be realized or to be discontinued, it's also left up to the agency to communicate that accurately to the public. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to provide the data that the agency needs to be able to actually inform their decision making. And so when the scope of the risk evaluation changes throughout the risk evaluation process, and you go into that process providing the agency data on conditions of use that you believe that they're going to be evaluating, and then you see a risk evaluation that includes additional conditions of use that were not included in the original scope, it puts stakeholders, it puts the public at a disadvantage because that data is not available. And oftentimes, because of the finite timeline that the agency has to be able to complete their risk evaluation, you aren't able to provide that data in the timeline that's able to inform the risk evaluation decision making.
One of the hallmarks of the Biden EPA was revising the risk evaluations of the first Trump EPA. The first Trump EPA completed 10 risk evaluations, and the Biden EPA then decided it needed to reconsider most of them. And the second Trump EPA has announced that it's reconsidering 2 of the Biden risk evaluations. Meanwhile, EPA has missed its statutory deadlines to complete multiple risk evaluations and is under a consent decree to finalize them. How should EPA balance the need to improve risk evaluations that it considers inaccurate or incomplete against its need to get things done, to complete risk evaluations in accordance with statutory deadlines so that it can move on to risk management? Anyone have some thoughts on that one?
So maybe I'll kick us off. So I think that the agency can really look at being very clear on what they need to make their decisions, right? Because timelines are important. I think it's unfortunate that we are 10 years later and we are just barely getting through final risk evaluations of the first identified chemistries, realistically, because they've been revisited across administrations. And that's because there's been changes in the evaluation of the science policy and the data and the framework that they're utilizing. I mean, I think we need some consistency and very clearly articulated frameworks and data requirements that will allow the agency to move forward in a timely fashion and also allow the stakeholders not to be debating, I think, over the course of years about what the process looks like. I think part of the challenge of the timeliness for the agency right now is that the policies keep changing. And so it is trying to get some, solidification in what that actually looks like moving forward, and then be able to utilize that to underlie the evaluations moving forward. Otherwise, you don't get risk management decisions, you don't mitigate unreasonable risk, and then ultimately the public suffers.
Other thoughts?
Sure, I'll jump in. And I think we've seen since EPA started the whole process just about a decade ago until now, that EPA has definitely learned that what they know and what they don't know. And they have learned that the regulated population that they thought is the regulated population isn't necessarily the case, and that there are more people who are brought in, there are more industries, there are more uses. And as we've seen that EPA engaged in a pre-prioritization process where they put out, this is what we're thinking about, step up, and that enables word to get out, and it lets people realize EPA is considering something. And if either affected companies or industries don't want to be put in a position where EPA is moving ahead with an evaluation with what stakeholders believe is incomplete information, it allows people on the front end to get engaged and provide that information. And so I think while we're definitely engaged in a learning process, and that includes EPA and all interested stakeholders, and I think it's clear that EPA has definitely learned that in order for it to complete evaluations in a timely fashion, it means there's a lot of planning involved. And that means getting word out as early as possible so that people can provide information so that when EPA does conduct evaluations, it's done with the most robust set of information that it has.
So it's important for all stakeholders to do their part to help EPA develop the best risk evaluation it can, ideally within the statutory deadlines.
I think that's exactly right, Mark. I mean, this is about, coming to the table early with EPA coming to the table with stakeholders, recognizing that these are the chemistries that we plan on evaluating through the prioritization process. This is where we scoped it, so this is where we're going to be focusing our time and attention. This is where we do or don't have sufficient data to be able to inform our decision making. It allows stakeholders to come to the table and provide that data. It also allows them to be able to coordinate better with some of the other federal agencies. So if there are already reviews that have happened, either by another federal agency or by another global agency that have recently evaluated those chemistries, then they might be able to, have conversations with those other agencies to say, okay, well, how did you get to your decision making? Are we using the same data? Is there some data missing in the pool that we currently have? Or is there something that would drive a different decision if there was a specific data point that's missing?
Okay. Well, let's move on to IRIS, a much discussed topic over the 10 years. EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS, has produced many detailed hazard assessments of chemicals, including those undergoing risk evaluations. Some IRIS assessments have proven particularly controversial for their science policy judgments. In April 2026, the EPA Deputy Administrator issued a memorandum on the future development and use of risk assessments that said, going forward, regulatory programs, rather than the group that produces or did produce IRIS assessments, will develop their own hazard assessments. And in effect, it ended the IRIS program. Rashmi, what's your reaction to that?
Well, understandably, my reaction is not very happy. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here as another scientist on the panel. I will try to emphasize the importance of the IRIS program. The IRIS program was established in the 1980s to intentionally separate the risk assessment process from the risk management process. IRIS has, since their inception, generated 572 different hazard values for unique chemicals. And these toxicity values have remained relatively insulated from political and policy influence. They also adopt the most rigorous scientific methods to derive those hazard values. And so it really is within the EPA a jewel of scientific rigor and producing hazard values that can then be used by other programs within the agency. It's also an emblem of government efficiency. When you have one group that is insulated from the political and policy from those influences, coming up with these science-based hazard values, they can then be shared across programs, and it reduces time and resources that are required to derive those values and being replicated by other programs. So for very, very many reasons, the IRIS program is so important to establish the scientific foundations for chemical risk assessment.
Other thoughts about IRIS?
Yeah, I would just uplift one thing that Rashmi said, which is that it really does reduce inefficiencies. And so to the extent that we're sitting here talking about how can EPA meet their timelines better, how can they work towards this backlog of risk evaluations to eliminate a program that provides this information that can be used in risk evaluations, and to instead ask individual offices to do that is sort of counterintuitive.
Kimberly, any thoughts?
Of course, I have some thoughts here.
Oh, my goodness.
So surprising, I have thoughts. So I've spent actually a good bit of my career evaluating assessments that have come through the IRIS program, and I have found that it has lacked scientific rigor and has oftentimes not been transparent in how they have gotten to their determinations of hazard assessments specifically, and incorporating even peer review feedback as part of that process. So while I believe that the original intent of the program was really focused on trying to be supportive and support the agency's work for their risk evaluation processes, I don't think it's been living up to that mission. There has been calls for more than a decade about the challenges that are associated with the IRIS program. And so while we think about how can you do science better within the agency, having the program offices focus in on where they have regulatory needs, where they have data-specific needs that they have to drive decision-making for public health risk, I think that's a better use of the agency's time and resources. Also, I recognize that there is a lot of data that has been generated by the IRIS program, and it has consolidated scientific information, but it has also overlaid some policy decisions that have not necessarily been aligned by other jurisdictions. And so there is, I believe, a way to be able to transition some of that information where you have access to some of the scientific information without the policy overlays that have hindered, I think, the ability of IRIS program to be effective. And I think it is, I think important that the program offices understand and really have the lead on the data that they need to make regulatory decisions moving forward. Oftentimes as well, let's not forget that IRIS assessments haven't been very timely either. So we've been talking about the TSCA risk evaluations, and we're 10 years later, and we've had just over 10 or more assessments that have been completed. Oftentimes it takes more than 10 years sometimes for an IRIS assessment to be generated. So that's not really helping a program office that has to make decisions for a regulatory purpose either. And so I think revisiting and rethinking how the agency generates and it has available information to make their decisions is critically important if we want to get decisions made in a timely manner, and we want to make sure that they're using the best quality science to do so.
I might respond to that quickly and say that just the sheer number of chemicals and hazard assessments that IRIS has turned out really speaks to its efficiency. And you laid out the process of science being responsive to policy, but I will counter that and say that science, especially the scientific assessments that will eventually underlie chemical regulations and protect people and children from harmful exposures, should be insulated from policy and from political decisions. They should be rooted in the best available and most rigorous science, and that is the purpose of the IRIS program.
And I would say I would agree with you that it should be separate and independent from the policy decision. I don't believe that IRIS has been doing that. I think that realistically, if we look at, for example, the cancer guidelines that allow the agency to use a no threshold approach, and we don't see that enacted by the IRIS except for perhaps one time with chloroform, then that's a challenge when we know for sure that there is data that supports a threshold approach for multiple chemistries that have been adopted by other jurisdictions but have failed to be adopted by the IRIS program. To me, that is a policy decision that is being made. It's not a scientific decision when other scientists in other jurisdictions have looked at the exact same data and made a different decision.
Well, speaking of thresholds, let's focus on a recent risk evaluation from this one on formaldehyde. In the last full month of the Biden EPA issued a risk evaluation for formaldehyde, and a year later, the Trump EPA issued draft revisions that would, if finalized, they're still in draft, significantly change that risk evaluation. These draft changes highlight several science policy issues, as Kimberly just mentioned. For example, the changes no longer rely on the IRIS assessment. They would determine that the cancer of particular interest, nasopharyngeal cancer, has a threshold with respect to formaldehyde based on sensory irritation. And so the draft changes rejected the usual linear low-dose model for this cancer as advanced by the IRIS assessment. The draft changes also relied on an uncertainty factor of 1 for interpersonal variations rather than the usual factors of 3 or 10, and that had significant impact on the risk calculations. So what do these proposed changes mean for EPA's science policies?
So maybe I'll kick us off, and not to get too in the weeds here, maybe we can just keep it at a high level. This is realistically about what does the data tell you, right? And formaldehyde specifically is one of the most well-studied chemistries, and it has thousands of publications associated with it from a toxicological perspective, from an epidemiology perspective, from a mode of action perspective. And so when we look at, you have, an EPA that has evaluated it at one point in time that, again, decided that there was not a threshold approach associated with the formaldehyde data. Given what we know about that chemistry, given what we know about other jurisdictions that have evaluated formaldehyde recently within the last several years, and actually identify that there was a threshold, you have to ask yourself, well, why is that data not being considered, or why hasn't there been a scientific debate about it? And this is where I would say, one, that you need to look at the scientific data and you need to understand, does the process that I have allow me to apply a threshold approach, for example? In this case, it does. And what are the reasons that the agency has decided to move away from that threshold approach, and lay that out and actually put that forward to a peer review committee, for example, which didn't happen originally. And so when you have these scientific issues, I would say, that are, I think, significantly debated among a particular chemistry, to not have that raised during a peer review meeting, you get to these points where you have an agency coming back and revisiting those choices. And quite frankly, revisiting choices back and forth across years doesn't really help anyone. We want everyone to start with the first solid, highest quality science from the beginning, and being able to move on those decisions because we have confidence in the science has been adequately evaluated. I can tell you from personal experience, having worked on formaldehyde for more than a decade of my own personal career, is that the science does not support not having a linear approach. It really does support a threshold approach in this case.
Rashmi, I can feel you vibrating.
Yes, of course.
Please proceed.
Subtle, am I? Kimberly, you mentioned that there are thousands of studies on formaldehyde. That is true. The chapter is closed. The science is resolved. Formaldehyde is a carcinogen. It's a known carcinogen. It's been classified by multiple authoritative bodies as a carcinogen. Not only that, it's also mutagenic and genotoxic. And these are mechanisms that multiple scientific authoritative bodies have suggested require a non-threshold approach to assessing cancer risk. You can look into the literature, you can look into these authoritative statements. These are decades-old conclusions. This is not new science. Formaldehyde damages DNA as a pathway to the cancers that have been underscored by iris assessments and then peer-reviewed by the NASEM. It was not a standalone iris assessment. It took multiple years to complete, multiple rounds of peer revision, and then it was also peer-reviewed by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and endorsed by the NASEM. I don't know what more robust of a seal of approval you need from the scientific community that a non-threshold approach is required for formaldehyde cancer assessment.
I would say that, one of the things that's important that hasn't been mentioned, and again, this is kind of in the weeds, is that what we do know about formaldehyde, specifically in the case of the nasopharyngeal cancers, is that formaldehyde does not get past the nasopharyngeal nasal, right? So it's not moving throughout the body. I mean, there's a significant amount of data that is radio-labeled formaldehyde to be able to demonstrate that it doesn't move through the body. The other thing I think that's important about formaldehyde to know is that our bodies make formaldehyde, right? So we actually need it for metabolism. And so it is important to understand that, if there really was a no threshold approach to formaldehyde, then how is our body able to metabolize it and utilize it? And how are we able to exhale it? And we're all in this room. I think I've exhaled a sufficient amount of formaldehyde that is above what the iris value is for formaldehyde right now. And so I don't think anybody here, creating or keeling over from cancer. And so I'd say that, that has to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about whether or not a threshold is actually relevant for a chemistry like formaldehyde that is actually produced endogenously by the human body and required for metabolism.
I might respectfully push back and say that the argument that formaldehyde is required for metabolism is just not going to stand against the fact that formaldehyde is a known carcinogen. It's in multiple consumer products that we encounter on a daily basis, and it's in our environment. It's in the air that we breathe from industrial sources that are not being regulated. Those are not levels that can compare to the minuscule concentrations that may or may not be generated through metabolism of certain compounds. Those are apples and oranges. We need structures to make sure that the formaldehyde that people are exposed to, and especially people who live near facilities that are releasing millions of pounds of formaldehyde are exposed to, are reducing those harmful exposures. The threshold approach is the most scientifically rigorous method to actually coming up with a quantitative value to determine cancer risk. That then will plug into risk management. So there are many steps that come after that, but again, this is This is becoming a non-science issue. The changes that have been implemented in this re-evaluation of formaldehyde are not science-based, they're policy-based. This is no longer the scientific process.
So Kimberly mentioned that there were other authoritative bodies that have looked at these issues, and in particular, a number of bodies in Europe recently looked at essentially the same database as what EPA looked at and concluded that, yes, formaldehyde does have a mutagenic mode of action in addition to the one that drives the threshold conclusion, but that at low doses, the body's endogenous production of formaldehyde sort of overwhelms the additional aspects of it. On a more general basis, how should EPA weigh the judgments of other bodies outside the United States, such as Europe or Canada, and to what extent should it just make up its own mind?
Yeah, why is EPA even trying to consider those assessments? IRIS is an EPA body that made the conclusion that formaldehyde should be regulated, cancer should be assessed using a non-threshold approach. That is an EPA entity. It was then endorsed by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I don't know why there's any need scientifically to seek out other assessments.
And I would respectfully disagree that there is a need to look at other assessments. I mean, if we just think about scientific discourse collectively, science moves and changes, and the reason why it's so important is that there is a scientific debate like we're having right now. And when there is other data that's available or that has been generated by another jurisdiction, I think it is important, while it doesn't supersede or circumvent the existing agency's authority, I think it's important for them to take that information into consideration and to understand why they might be planning to make a different decision from a jurisdiction that might have just recently evaluated that same chemistry. Because I think if you don't do that, then you're doing a disservice to your own review by not taking into consideration other scientific opinions that have been evaluated at that point in time.
So the December 2024 Biden EPA risk evaluation found that for some communities, the highest risk exceeded the 10 to the minus 6 benchmark, particularly those near releasing facilities. Nevertheless, it did not find that there was an unreasonable risk to the general population. What's the relationship between the risk benchmarks of 10 to the minus 6 for general population, 10 to the minus 4 for workers that EPA has traditionally relied on, and its ultimate goal of determining unreasonable risk?
Well, and again, not to get into the weeds for our audience here, but this is really all about being very clear about what the initial benchmarks are that you're evaluating unreasonable risk by. And so having the agency be very clear that this is the benchmark that we're using, this is the 10x by 4, 5, 6, 7 that we plan on using to determine whether or not there is an unreasonable risk and why we've selected that, why that may be different from other scientific jurisdictions that have evaluated that same chemistry and selected a different value, I think is critically important. When that moves around across assessments or is inconsistent across assessments, that's where there's, I think, concerns. And this is true for formaldehyde, but realistically, that's true for any chemistry that might be going through this process. When you don't have very clear benchmarks or a priori criteria when you're evaluating chemistry, it's very hard to understand when something is likely going to be an unreasonable risk or when it's not, and when there's realistically data or gaps that are missing that might need to be filled to address that question.
Yeah, I agree with that. So this is actually something that we've been seeing. This has become something of a moving benchmark, a moving goalpost. So traditionally, as Mark noted, 10 to the negative 6 was used as the unreasonable risk benchmark for cancer risks for general populations. I'll call it 1 in a million because I'm not a scientist and I don't like talking about scientific notation. But the 1 in a million benchmark has been traditionally used. It is something that EPA and the fence line assessment methodology, the fence line screening methodology, it endorsed that. The SAC has endorsed it. It is now shifting. So in the 1-2 DCA risk evaluation, for example, using that 1 in a million benchmark, EPA found that some 80,000 people would be exposed to lifetime cancer risks that are unreasonable. Instead of actually finding that those risks are unreasonable to the general population, instead it said, actually, for general population, we're using a range now. We're going to say anywhere between 10 to the negative 4, 1 in 10,000, to 10 to the negative 6, 1 in a million. And so when you do have these moving goalposts, what you end up having is arbitrary decision-making that doesn't protect communities and ends up with risk management rules that are going to leave people who are living near these facilities exposed to elevated cancer risks. I'll stop there, but I have more to say on this. Go ahead.
I agree with you fully, Kelly. I also agree with you, Kimberly. There can't be moving goalposts when it comes to determining cutoffs for when you consider a cancer risk unacceptable. Find the cancer value using a non-threshold approach, but there are certain levels at which you need to start reducing exposures because there are appreciable risks to the population. The 10 to the negative 6 or 1 in 1 million benchmark, the context behind that is it actually originates from as early as the 1980s. The Clean Air Act actually has language about EPA striving to reduce exposures when the risks exceed that 1 in 1 million benchmark. This is EPA's own language. It has rightfully so been the practice to come up with regulatory action after risk exceeds that 1 in 1 million benchmark. And unfortunately, as Kelly was mentioning, that goalpost is moving and it's becoming inconsistent. And that is not good for public health.
So June 1, last week, marked the 1-year anniversary since the oral argument in the methylene chloride case. During that, and we don't have a decision yet, during that oral argument, one of the 3 panelists asked the EPA advocate, where did this 10 to the minus 6 threshold come from? It was as though they'd never heard of it. It'll be very interesting to see what that decision, if it ever does come down, has to say about this question. Let's move on a little bit. EPA must make risk determinations without regard to cost or other non-risk factors. What factors other than risk calculations, like 10 to the minus 6, if any, should enter into a risk determination?
So I can kick us off. I do want to mention that 10 to the negative 6, we've sort of been talking about it as though it's this bright line rule, and EPA has expressly said that it's not going to be a bright line rule. And so what they have ultimately done in practice is if they find a risk that is exceeding that benchmark, or in the case of non-cancer risks, it's actually below the benchmark MOE, which is very confusing when you're drafting and proofing all of these documents. What EPA has essentially said is that will not be a bright line, but if you find risks that are exceeding the benchmark for cancer, they'll find a reason to call it no unreasonable risk, but they won't ever do the opposite. So if you find something that is slightly below the benchmark for cancer or slightly above for non-cancer risks, they'll just say, okay, that's fine, the chemical passes. And this is really problematic because you can't have this one-way ratchet where it's a bright line only for certain circumstances and not for others. And I will just say that this does seem to comport with some of the reporting that we've seen recently. There was this really great article from CNN from Renee Marsh a couple of days ago that talks about how scientists in EPA are being pushed to find no unreasonable risk, even if you have risk calculations that initially do appear to pose unreasonable risk. So I wanted to just clarify that when we're talking about this, how this benchmark is really treated.
Yeah, and maybe I can come back to that because, again, this is all about good science, high quality science and data that the agency can rely on, and being able to have a process that is very clear and accurate to the public as they look at it, and also to the risk assessors within the agency, because you want to make sure that they're following the same processes as they're looking or doing assessments overall, right? So if we, stick to what you mentioned, Kelly, about the changes in the margin of exposure related estimates, or what the agency considers their bright red line or not bright red line. I mean, yes, there is likely flexibility in what the agency is doing associated with a margin of exposure, but articulating that very clearly to the public, I think, is important. I think the other thing that we were debating about earlier was the threshold approach, right? And so there's always going to be a scientific debate among the scientific communities about whether or not a chemistry is or is not a threshold. And so, one of the things that, the agency could also be doing moving forward is when there is sufficient evidence on both sides of those is to present both of those so that the peer review panel and the public can actually provide content and feedback on that process. Instead of making a unilateral decision that will likely get arbitrated again, either through the scientific community or litigated at some point in the future. I think it's more efficient for the agency to be able to present that data and be able to say, well, we've looked at both cases and we're presenting that to our peer review community for this assessment. We're also presenting it to the public for comments on that about whether or not this makes sense or not and why.
I do have some skepticism that EPA will, if they're saying that they don't have the resources to consider, for example, all conditions of use as the law requires, that they're going to do risk analysis of all conditions of use using multiple PODs to derive the benchmark MOE.
I want to also elevate something that Kelly said previously, which is this departure ultimately from the scientific process. We've been seeing this very troubling trend, and I have personally poured through the probably over 1,000 pages of technical risk evaluation documents at this point, task risk evaluation documents, and over the course of the last several years, there's a disturbing trend where risk assessors, and you can see this clearly in the narrative, are denying existing scientific evidence, dismissing conclusions of unreasonable risk, with no real scientific rationale. This is now reflected, as Kelly was mentioning, in the CNN article that just came out and in the Peer article that just came out, that risk assessors in the current administration are being trained to find ways to come up with no unreasonable risk conclusions. This is no longer science. This is not the scientific process. This is storytelling. And I think that was actually a word that was used in the training video, is that risk assessment is a storytelling process. It is not a storytelling process. It is a quantitative, rigorous science assessment that then supports regulation that protects all of us from harmful chemicals. This departure from the scientific process into a storytelling risk assessment narrative is the most dangerous issue that we face right now.
Now that we've got that issue resolved, let's talk about peer review. Peer review is expressly part of the statutory requirement for the use of best available science, but at least in the case of formaldehyde, there were a lot of criticisms of the peer review process. What suggestions do you have for improving the peer review process?
I mean, I think there are some just base level suggestions for any peer review process. One is just to get the information out early, so to have a very clear understanding of what the charge of the peer review committee is and what the scientific questions on the table are, and be very clear of what you're asking that peer review committee to do, as well as for the public when they're providing comments in. I mean, if they're, in the case of formaldehyde, where we were just going back and forth about threshold or non-threshold approach, about uncertainty factors, about margin of exposure, when there are very key scientific issues like that on the table, being very articulate in presenting that to your peer reviewers so that you know that these are where we're looking. There's scientific debate on these issues. There's clear misdirection, misunderstanding about these in the scientific community, and we'd like to get an opinion from our peer reviewers on EPA's direction here. I think sometimes what we see in some of these peer review processes is that while there is lengthy charges, it kind of just gives a lot of wiggle room, right? And it's like you have a peer review panel of 15 people, half say this, half say that, and then it meets somewhere in the middle, versus having a real scientific debate about a specific scientific issue and then having what we would call a firm recommendation to the agency about how they believe the agency should move forward. A lot of times the agency has a lot of purview because it's fairly ambiguous in some of the peer review reports on what they should do. And so having the peer reviewers have a much stronger opinion about how they should move forward, I think might be helpful. Again, a lot of the times, the information actually is not released out to the public very early in some of these peer review processes. Sometimes the peer review are very truncated. I mean, we know the agency's resources are relatively limited, and sometimes they have in the past, over the last 10 years, been evaluating multiple chemistries over the course of a week, which has presented a challenge for the agency as well. And then a lot of the materials oftentimes I think don't necessarily go out to some of those peer reviewers early enough, and so they don't really have sufficient time to really evaluate the materials before they get into the meetings.
So the TSCA program has the Science Advisory Committee on Chemicals, or the SAC, which is its designated scientific peer review committee. It's congressionally mandated under FACA. This committee is, and I agree with you that scientific peer review is an essential part of the scientific process. You need to have scientific debate. Multiple opinions should be weighing in on the scientific peer review process. However, that process should also be insulated from policy. Scientific peer review committees now, especially the SAC, we're seeing many members being nominated with financial conflicts of interest, direct financial conflicts of interest with the industries that manufacture the chemicals that are being regulated or being considered in those scientific assessments. One of the biggest improvements that can be made to the scientific peer review process of TSCA evaluations is to eliminate financial conflicts of interest on the SAC.
And there are conflict of interest and biased policies as part of the SAC process,
So one of my favorite acronyms in the TSCA area is NAMS, because I can never remember what NAMS stands for. It has to do with animal testing, or alternatives to animal testing. The 2016 amendments included Section 4H, which directs EPA to help develop alternatives to tests on vertebrate animals, such as computational toxicology and bioinformatics and high-throughput screening methods. Last week, EPA announced their approval of 13 new alternative test methods to replace the use of animal studies, also known as New Approach Methods, or NAMs, and solicited nominations for additional NAMs. What's the significance of these developments for risk evaluation?
So maybe I'll kick us off. And I'd say, one, NAMs are very promising, but we also have to make sure, because I think we all would prefer to use less animals for regulatory testing overall, which is what the NAMs are supposed to do. They have to be predictive, though. So we have to be able to have confidence in the fact that when you test a chemical through a NAMs process, that any of the results, whether adverse or negative results that you get, that they are actually predictive of what you likely see in an in vivo model or a human model. I think a couple of things there. I mean, the ACC, who I'm employed with, we have a long-range research initiative that we've done a decades-long work for NAMs-related research in coordination with multiple stakeholders. We also know that the National Institute of Health Foundation has a NAM validation effort that has been going on as well, where they're looking to pull stakeholders together so they can get a better understanding of the NAMs that exist and be able to validate those approaches so that they actually improve regulatory decision-making moving forward.
I will say that we're at a critical point when it comes to new approach methodologies. As Kimberly said, they do hold promise in terms of rapidly screening chemicals for toxicity. That's one of their many advantages, is you can put multiple chemicals into a high throughput dish. I'm probably getting very technical now, but there are many advantages to new approach methods. We eventually will need to move away from animal testing. That is the reality. However, we're not there yet. The policies are preceding the science. There are policies now that NIH just released last year that now require NAMs to be a component of any federally funded grant. This means that you can't just run an animal toxicology study and get that funded by the NIH anymore. You have to incorporate an element of NAMs. So we are going to be generating a lot of NAMs data as a scientific community. There are not significant guardrails or policies in place for the implementation of NAMs in decision-making to result in health protective rulemaking. And I will detail a little bit on the kind of disturbing patterns that we've seen within the agency on the implementation of data from NAMs. In the Office of Pesticide Programs, we've seen NAMs being used to downplay neurodevelopmental toxicity risk for a class of pesticides called organophosphate pesticides that we've known for decades cause neurodevelopmental harm in infants and children who are exposed. We've also seen in recent risk evaluations where NAMs are being used to replace existing animal and epidemiologic evidence when there was existing high-quality cancer bioassays, for example, showing the potential for p-dichlorobenzene to cause tumors in rodents. That was dismissed using pathways that were derived from new approach methods. There's an industry-derived framework called the RECAP framework, which is now being used to waive the need for cancer assessment altogether in TSCA risk evaluations. Waive the need to look at cancer based on a NAMs-based framework. these are not health protective implementations of NAMs. NAMs do have promise. They are probably the future of toxicology and of risk assessment, but we don't have the structures in place to prevent agencies like EPA from using NAMs to downplay risk and hazard, and that is another danger that we're facing.
Thank you all. We've talked to some degree from an industry perspective and from an NGO perspective, but another group of stakeholders in risk evaluations is federal agencies. Under Section 9D of TSCA, in administering the statute, EPA must consult with other federal agencies. How can EPA do that better than it has in the risk evaluation process? For example, how should EPA consult with OSHA on assessing workplace exposures? Judy, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think I'll just pick up on something that I mentioned earlier, which is the earlier you start doing things, the better. And I think as we've seen with some of the evaluations, particularly where it came to concerns that were raised in aerospace and defense industries, where in the end of the day, it was the Department of Defense that had to directly engage with EPA because they believed EPA didn't fully understand the extent to which certain substances were used and the criticality of those in national defense, for national defense purposes, that if there had been that engagement earlier on, it would have prevented the slowing down of the process. And so, to that end, and as I mentioned before, I think EPA is learning this, to engage on workplace exposure issues with OSHA earlier, to get them involved in the process, and not necessarily even OSHA, but also just in those areas where there are bodies that have expertise in that area, they should engage. But clearly, there are going to be other agencies that have either regulate uses or involved in uses which will be affected by EPA action. And so to the extent that EPA doesn't come to a decision and then run this by other agencies and say, hey, are you good with this? It'll save them time and angst and having to rework things if they started that process, the consultation process, at the beginning, the same way as I mentioned before, that just to get stakeholders involved early on in the process.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I would echo what Judah said. I think at the beginning of the process and prioritization and scoping, it is really important to get the other federal agencies engaged during that time so you can understand the conditions of use that they're using that particular chemistry in and why, for example, and any data that they might have already generated associated with that. The other part of that is what Judah mentioned, which we haven't talked a lot about here, is on the workplace exposure. So workplace exposure assessment specifically is an area that hasn't been well seeded by EPA in the past. And so it's really something that is very new to them over the last 10 years of really doing occupational exposure related assessments. So when you have agencies that have experience in this and that have been doing occupational exposure assessments for a long time, it's beneficial for EBA to tap into some of that experience, to understand what kind of workplace assessments they do and why, what approaches they've utilized in the past and why they've utilized those approaches. It doesn't mean that EPA has to adopt wholeheartedly that assessment approach, but it is important that if there's already expertise that exists with other federal agencies, especially expertise that is not currently housed within the agency, that they leverage and utilize that moving forward so they can make better decisions going forward. The other piece of this is on the compliance. And so while I think there's the panel next is going to get into risk management, you also need to make sure that you understand when you're making decisions about the risk evaluation process, are you going to be running counter to risk management practices that already exist with another federal agency like OSHA? And understanding where there might be discordances or challenges in compliance with that and having that conversation early so that the agencies can talk through what is the mechanism for risk management compliance associated with an unreasonable risk determination and how they can move forward so you don't have miscommunication or duplication in regulations among two agencies that might be disparate or different.
So just on that point, I do think there are consulting with other agencies for their data early makes sense. I think there are some sort of limitations on that, though, and some guardrails that EPA should be implementing, which is not just merely looking at what regulatory limits there are, for example, but actually looking at what emissions or what exposures are actually occurring. So we know that there are often emissions limits for certain chemicals that are regularly violated. And so just a flag of caution that EPA shouldn't just say, okay, well, under the Clean Air Act, this is the amount of this HAP that is allowed to be emitted, and saying that's enough, that's all we have to do for looking at exposures. I think the only other piece is that I don't think that comparing risk management approaches is really appropriate at the risk evaluation stage. That's something that comes later. And so while I think it's important to have early engagement, I would just put a flag of caution that anything that would get into the non-risk factors that are driving risk evaluation and driving a risk determination would be inappropriate.
And Kelly, let me just weigh in that I didn't want to conflate both the risk management and risk evaluation. I was just mentioning the risk management as the second piece of an opportunity for coordination with the federal agencies.
Yeah.
So EPA's authority to collect fees to support risk evaluations in Section 26B is going to expire at the end of September, unless Congress acts to extend it, and there'll be a panel talking about legislation. But EPA's current budget request to Congress calls for reducing TSCA funding by eliminating 61 full-time equivalents, and also the money to pay them. So EPA is going to be looking at less money to conduct risk evaluations, which raises the question, how can EPA reduce the cost of risk evaluations and reduce the time needed to complete them?
So maybe I'll weigh in here. I mean, I think obviously I'm not in a position, and none of our stakeholders are on the stage, to speak to what Congress will or will not give the agency and how the agency can or cannot use the resources that it has. But I mean, I think one of the things that's probably most important is that the agency needs to be able to have the science and data that it needs to make the right decision to move forward in the risk evaluation. And so they need to think about if there are efficiencies in their process that don't compromise the science, that don't compromise the data, that allow them to move more efficiently, then those are things that they may be able to look at. But I think we all want to make sure that there's high quality risk evaluations moving forward and that the agency is able to do that in a timely fashion.
I'll be the broken record. It's the same thing that I think we've all been agreeing upon throughout the entire panel, is that EPA has to engage early and often. And if they're able to get as much good quality information that they can on the front end, it'll just make the process move smoother. And I, as I said, also, I think they're learning that, but it's a process and it's just going to take time.
I've mentioned throughout the panel several improvements that could be made to the scientific process of TSCA risk evaluations. I want to emphasize that these improvements will not cost more money or take more time. These are, simple in some matters, Excel spreadsheet calculations that EPA can be adding on. Starting the process of risk assessment with a rigorous systematic review is probably the most beneficial thing that the agency can do to improve efficiency. They start off with a complete evidence base, all of the reasonably available information that they can obtain to make hazard and risk determinations down the line. Early and very early in the process, ideally. Starting off with the most amount of rigorous scientific information that's then evaluated in a rigorous way is the most efficient way to result in a health protective risk evaluation.
I agree with that. And I think to add to that, not excluding exposure pathways or known conditions of use at the front end of a risk evaluation, so you don't end up in a situation where the Biden administration, for example, had to then go back and look at exposures to 1,4-dioxane that had been omitted from the initial Trump 1 risk evaluation.
Well, I've learned a lot about risk evaluations, and I want to thank this distinguished panel for all your thoughts and contributions. And I encourage you to remain in the audience to the extent you can, because there's lots of interesting stuff to come ahead.
I hope you enjoyed this fascinating panel discussion on risk evaluation. For more information on this fabulous conference, please visit our website at www.lawbc.com. All Things Chemical is produced by Jackson Bierfeld at Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We will be back again soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.